Welcome everyone to our ninth session on Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. We've had some very rich conversation over the last several months. We'll be taking a break over the next few weeks, but we will continue studying the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. And chapter 3 is that chapter that has the famous, well-known beginning. There's a time for every season, a time for planting and a time for harvesting. And we spoke at length about that. And then the next section that came afterwards. And we're really veering between several different interpretations of Kohelet's words. On one hand, Kohelet is cynical. On the other hand, he's very cynical about humanity, about what it means to be a human being, about finding meaning in life and the goodness of human beings. On the other hand, we're connecting to how deep he's willing to go into, well, what is life truly about? And what are we doing here in this world? And he has a unique ability to teach us because he's Kohelet. He's King Solomon, who had everything, who had every luxury, who had every good in the world, who had hundreds of spouses and whatever, everything that came his way. And now, according to tradition, right, he's an elderly man, and he's looking back at his life and he's imparting wisdom to us from that unique position. And I just wanted to address something that came up last time. We've several times we've asked this question. Well, Kohelet, when he talks about what is life about, has not mentioned family or friends very much, right? I think it was Alan who asked that question. He's not saying, find meaning with your loved ones and find meaning with your friends. And I was thinking about it and discussing that. And two thoughts came to me. One is he's not talking to us in some sense as an individual. He's talking to us as someone who's looking at all of humanity and looking at the broad strokes. But then another is that maybe this is one of the, he's a good teacher for us because of how he's explored materialism and all the good things, so to speak. But he's also a teacher who's wealthy and, sometimes, I think about not all, but many of the people I know whom are very wealthy, and their families often have a lot of issues, right? The children are fighting over money, and they don't know if people are their friends because of their money, or if they're really their friends because they want to be their friends. I knew someone who came from a very wealthy family, and they were at camp one year, the Jewish camp, and their parents came in a plane to pick them up, like landed on the lake and picked him up. And suddenly everybody wanted to be their friend. And I didn't know if people wanted to really be my friend because of who I am or because they thought it was cool that my parents came to pick me up on the plane. So I was thinking about that aspect too, that, the friendship and family is different for people of that level of power and of wealth, perhaps. And so the lesson, they teach us a different lesson. Anybody have any thoughts or anything left over from last week before we begin to study this morning and look at the end of chapter 3? Okay. My computer is, of course, blocking. Here we go. So I'm Ecclesiastes, and now I'll go and share my screen. And I've gone too far into Ecclesiastes. So here we go. So last time we talked a lot about whatever has happened has already happened. There's nothing new under the sun, and where that was coming from. We've talked a lot about under the sun. David's been talking a lot about under the sun, and maybe we need to reach above the sun, and that's part of where we are. So here we are, verse 18, a good verse to start on. Chai. So Alan, would you begin reading for us? We're going to read the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. Again, the chapters are much later division created by monks, Christian monks, and scholars. And our tradition doesn't always break things down in the same way. And, in my mind, it's the same theme that continues between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. So we're going to read into chapter 4 a little bit. So Alan, go ahead. Please read.
Hey, I mused, God will doom both righteous and wicked, for there is a time for every experience and for every happening. So I decided, as regards men, to disassociate them from the divine beings and to face the fact that they are beasts. For in respect of the fate of man and the fate of beast, they have one and the same fate. As the one dies, so dies the other, and both have the same life breath. Man has no superiority over beast, since both amount to nothing. Both go to the same place. Both came from dust, and both return to dust. Who knows if a man's life breath does rise upward, and if a beast's breath does sink down into the earth? I saw that there is nothing better for man than to enjoy his possessions, since that is his portion. For who can enable him to see what will happen afterward?
Portion is possession.
It is. Possessions is a strange. I heard Nancy say, I think it was Nancy. Possessions is a strange word here. We'll talk about all this more in depth, but really in the Hebrew, the word is ma'asav, which could easily mean deeds too. So it's interesting that the new JPS translation translated possessions, which is a much more cynical comment than deeds. Just enjoy your possessions, then enjoy your deeds is a much more positive or lofty statement to me than just enjoy your possessions. But anyway, let's read a little bit further and then we'll go back. And I whenever I read this section of Kohelet, I think, oh, this is depressing, but I think there's actually a very not quite as depressing way to look at it. Okay.
I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. Then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate. Oh, let me try that one again.
Oh, good. No, you're almost there. Yeah, go ahead.
Then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living. And happier than either are those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun. I have also noted that all labor and skillful enterprise come from men's envy of one another futility and pursuit of wind.
Okay. I think we're going to stop with this now for now. And go into it. And I think, as I said, there is a way to look at this that's less, not quite as down as he appears. And I was just thinking of Donna, the sunlight that was coming just around you as you were at the beginning, and this whole idea of under the sun, and maybe there's always a way to reach for the sun. And actually, we just started a new committee in the synagogue. It's called the Shemesh Sunshine Committee. And the purpose of this committee is going to be to just call people up and say hi and wish them happy birthday and make people feel good. So, sometimes just a little bit of sunshine can help for all the stuff that's under the sun. Okay. So I decided, as regards men, to disassociate them from the divine beings and to face the fact that they are beasts. For in respect of the fate of man, of the fate of beasts, have one and the same fate. As one dies, so dies the other. This whole idea of, I don't know if any of you remember this, when in the high holidays, towards the beginning of the service, there's a section that talks about, the quotes Kohelet here, and talks about, we come from dust and we're going from dust and we have no superiority over the beast. And what do you make of all of this?
Is he using B'nai Adam differently than Adam?
Maimonides points out that it's in, and he points out the tract that it's in the Talmud, that when people say B'nai Adam, they're talking sort of about the unwashed or the unwise or the simple people. When they're talking about Adam, they're talking about people who have a little, maybe more on the ball. I'm not sure if that holds in the use of Kohalis with B'nai Adam versus Adam. But it's clear that Maimonides is making that point and uses that in the Guide for the Perplexed to make that meaning.
Interesting. I haven't seen that. I mean, the most typical term for that is Am Haaretz, right? Which means like the people of the earth. That's kind of a term for it. But B'nai, the Bible is usually very, at least according to the rabbi is very conscious, intentional about what words he uses for a man or for a human being. Is it Adam or Ben Adam or Ish or Gever? And there's a whole kind of categorization. And so the Ben Adam, and in this context, he did use B'nai Adam instead of Adam. And maybe, and I like that, because maybe the way I read this is maybe saying that, if you don't live your life as an Adam, if you don't try and be lofty in the way you live and try and be more intentional and aware and present, then you are just like a beast, because we go through the same thing the beasts do. When we live, we die, we get sick. And so how do you elevate yourself above that fate of a Ben Adam to become an Adam? I love looking at it that way.
I've got one. Oh, Deborah, were you going to say something?
No, I was just saying it's interesting.
I've got one question and then one comment.
Okay.
The question is about verse 20.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't ever remember hearing about the animals coming from dust. I know we talk about man coming from dust to dust. So is that commonly accepted, or is that just Kohelet's opinion?
So it's really interesting, because that expression of we come from the dust and we go to the dust that we say at funerals, and I mean a lot of the funeral biblical wording comes from Kohelet and comes from the book of Job, and so it's actually it might even come from here, that we come from the dust, but we forget the part that the verse is talking about us and beasts, and we just kind of reappropriated it to be just about us. So, but it is interesting, isn't it, that really in the context, it's talking about both us and all. I mean, when it's talking about beasts, in my mind, it's talking about, all life, right? All life comes from dust and goes to dust, all living things. I mean, it's striking this verse that we have hakol, right? Everything, where it's translated as both go to the same place, both come from dust and both come from dust. But in the Hebrew is everything goes to one place. Everything was from dust and everything returns to dust. So it's not, the both is them translating it in its context, but in the Hebrew it's hakol, it's everything.
Everything goes.
Rabbi,
Can I just finish my
Go
thought?
ahead, Alan. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then going to verse 19, where he says, man has no superiority over beasts since both amount to nothing. I always think when he's talking about man amounts to nothing, that man isn't living up to his potential, that man isn't doing what God wants him to do, which is really a question of the capacity to do that, as opposed to a beast, where I think I would assume they don't have that capacity. So I guess I'm a little, I don't know if it's bothered, but the comparison of us to beasts here doesn't really hit me very strongly.
I think, and what you're talking about is a traditional view, which is in a traditional view, there are kingdoms in the world. In the human kingdom, what makes the human kingdom above in the rabbinic thinking from the animal kingdom is that we have that ability to be godly in a way, or to touch. We're made in the image of God, right? I mean, animals are in the rabbinic thinking, animals, are part of nature and part of creation, obviously, but they don't have that spark of God. So what he's saying is, I understand why it would be bothering you, and it's a big statement. And in the Hebrew, in some ways, it's even more striking, because he says umotar, and what is superior of ha'adam, of man, over beast, ayin, is nothing. It's even more dramatically said in the Hebrew. Is nothingness. There's nothing.
How do you
So-
define?
Yes, I
nothing?
think, I'm sorry.
How do you define nothing? Because the beast, let's leave man aside for a minute, the beast does a lot.
That's true too. Yeah.
Beast, you couldn't have, plant, you couldn't travel, they couldn't do anything.
Yeah. It's very true. And the beast, also this is the way the rabbinic thing, but the beast sacrifices itself to provide food for human
Food,
being,
right.
so it's in kind of a certain way. But so maybe it's not saying that a beast is nothing, but it's saying that, he's saying, really, at least the pshat, the simple meaning to me is that, look, we both go through, we can go through life, all the things that, out of all the things that we were saying at the beginning of the chapter, right? There's a time to go to war and a time for peace. And there's a good many of them that apply to beasts too, right? Beasts have their good days and their bad days, probably. They don't have the awareness that we do. But, again, I give it a little spin that it maybe is not even there in the simple meaning of the text, which is one can go through life where your life is the same as an animal, in the sense that you're just living and going through all the things you go through, and in the end, what was the purpose of all of it? It can go like that if you don't try and bring some of that godliness into it, what I'm talking about. If you don't get into it, then your life maybe isn't that different than an animal. It's a very powerful statement, and it's a hard statement to hear, and hard to know what to do. Anybody else?
Yes.
Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you. I wanted to make two little points. One is you were just reading the Hebrew, and I wish you had gone on to the rest of it, because it's the rest of that verse, because it's so striking that the translation here is both amount to nothing, when it's the same phrase, hakol havel, right?
Yeah,
that they begin the whole book with,
Yeah.
that it futility, vanity, mere breath,
Shallow
whatever
breath.
you like.
Yeah.
And it gets, for some reason, they've gone for a variation of phrasing here, which it seems like it's literarily, well, you
Poetic
lose
decision.
you lose that quality of the theme there. But then, as to what you just said about the substance of it, it strikes me that I guess I'm of the school, if I can join that school, that believe that he offers that possibility. Maybe spirit goes upward, but he doesn't seem to really, he doesn't seem to bet anything on that. He seems to feel we are really, in that respect, we're part of that natural order you were referring to. I think that's his general view, but there is always that possibility that the classical, that is the David class theory, brings us back to the possibility of going beyond the sun, whatever.
I hear what you're saying, and it's one of the reasons that this book is uncomfortable to the tradition in places, because of lines like this, or the more the line that comes 3 lines after you were referring to is, who knows if a man's life breath goes upwards and the man's breath to sink down to the earth. The tradition doesn't want to doesn't like who knows. Who knows is not comfortable to any tradition. The tradition wants more certainty than who knows. But it's true in the Hevel, a kol Hevel, everything is vanity, or everything is a shallow breath, or everything is has much more shades than to nothing. Since both amount to nothing is much more definitive in a certain way than everything is fleeting. And I mean, he's talking about death, really, right? He's talking about mortality as the next line. Everything goes to the same place, and everything was from dust, and everything returns to dust. So he's talking about the and maybe the way I take the line 21, who knows if a man's life breath does rise upwards and if a man's breath does sink down into the earth. As all you know, I'm a pretty spiritual person, and I do believe in what happens afterwards. But there is an element of, the Kabbalah can tell you, exactly what happens after you pass away, and other world traditions. The chapter is what chapter the Bhagavad Gita has a whole thing of what happens when you die. But how, who knows, right? How those are glimpses maybe of what happens after we pass away. And in our tradition, I was talking about this with our high schoolers on Sunday morning. Our tradition is, in a certain sense, a disworldly tradition, because we choose to focus on this world because we don't know exactly. We have Olam Haba. We believe in all these things, and they're powerful. But on some level, we focus on this world as a people because of the uncertainty, right? And Hillel and Shammai, or the schools of Hillel and Shammai, have this big argument in the Talmud where they say, right? Hillel says, God created the world first and then created the heavens. And Shammai says, no, God created the heavens first and then the world. And what's the difference between the two? And Hillel says to Shammai, well, in your view, God created the attic first and then created the house. So Hillel believes that this world is the house and the heavens is the attic. And Shammai says, in your view, God created the footstool first and then the heavens. So in Shammai's view, so is this world the main house and the heavens are the attic, or is this world a footstool to the heavens? And those are two very different ways of looking at the world, right? And are we in the main place and the heavens just an attic you go to afterwards, or is this world a footstool to something much more substantial? And I think Kohelet to some degree is saying, hey, I don't know. And also Kohelet, just to bring this in the historical context, Kohelet seems to be coming at a time where the whole human being, the Judaism at least, was becoming more and more focused on an afterlife type of theology, which in biblical times we're not sure exactly what people completely believed. Anybody have any other thoughts about this? So,
I say under no.
If you could wait for half hour.
So here we go to the last verse of this chapter. I saw that there is nothing better for man than to enjoy his possessions or his deeds. I don't know, Phil, if you have another translation with you, because I think it's very different to enjoy his possessions or his deeds, since that is his portion. For who can enable him to see what will happen afterwards, right? This has been the whole focus of the part that we've been reading so far today, right? We don't know what's going to happen afterwards. We're going to dust. We came from dust, right? It's all to me, it reminds me of all those statements and the ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, right? From where does a human being come from? From a drop. From where are we going to maggots? And before whom are we standing? Before the King of Kings, the Holy One. So what do we do with this?
I don't know why.
Yes, I think.
I'm sorry, Phil, why they would use possessions, because deed seems to go much more with, since that is his portion. If our portion in life would be to do good deeds, but everything else we've been studying would say we don't want materialism to be so important. So it's kind of controversial.
It's nicer, isn't it? And it makes it a nicer read.
Yeah, I'd
Okay,
rather be
deed.
known for my deeds than for my house
Possession.
or an airplane like that guy had.
Yeah.
Yes, I think if we just go by the more literal, as Alter does, I was looking for that while we were talking. It's nothing is, and I saw that nothing is better than that man should rejoice in his works.
Mhm.
So I don't have that much Hebrew, but Yismach ha'adam
Sounds
b'ma'asav.
better.
It sounds like I don't know why they went for that translation, but there you are. That's what he seems to say.
Who translated it?
So, I mean, I'm sure there's a good reason. The people who translated are very smart, obviously.
Oh,
and
yeah,
they,
sure.
But it could be because, I mean, we have had a lot of mentions in so far in chapter 2, even more in chapter 3, but chapter 2 and 3 about our possessions, right? And he has gone to the place of, don't enjoy them, but it's let's see if we have any Rashi on this here. Okay. 5, the man should rejoice in his work. No, Rashi goes with work.
Hmm.
So this is what Rashi says. He should rejoice and eat in the toil of his hands, but not to widen his desire like the grave, to covet riches, to accumulate that which is not rightfully his. So he kind of goes in both, right? So he's saying, I guess he's understanding deeds as not good deeds, or in the terms of more lofty deeds, but just in your work in the world, right? And which is also where Alter seems to be going. So just we all have to work, and so just rejoice in the work that you have and what you do, and take meaning from it, because that's your portion. We all have a portion, right? We all have our portion in our world of what we have to do in the world. But I want to take it further and say, we all have our portion, we all have our work, but what brings our work meaning is also, how do we approach our work? And we can dedicate all of our work to God and to humanity, and that elevates our work, right? There's a sense we all have to work in the world, but how you approach your work actually makes a huge difference. If you can approach and say, I'm just doing this because I've got to put food on the table. And you can approach your work as, this is bringing meaning to me, and one can dedicate our work to other people. I mean, we all have our portions, and we all have different parts of our life to bring more or less meaning to what we're doing. But
it's interesting in reading this that not everybody here is crying and depressed. I mean, here's this wise Jewish man that's telling you that your life, your works, pretty well everything you can think of is useless, has no transcendent meaning, etc. Now, how is it that we're all sort of smiling and still going about our business? I actually think about this, and I think that what it is that in some way we sense, we can sort of sniff out the meaning that doesn't seem maybe even to have anything to do with our works, our possessions, our friends, our family. There's some other kind of meaning. Now you can say, well, that's just a belief that you have. But I think it's a little bit more than a belief. I actually think that in some way, I mean, supposing there is a spark of the divine in us, okay? I mean, I heard that rumor. You guys have heard that rumor too. Well, what does that mean to you to have a spark of the divine in you? What would that feel like to you? Is that just some abstract thought that's sitting there? Or can you actually hang around in that spark of the divine that's inside you? Can you actually be inside that feeling your life? And if you think about it that way, then it's not such a big deal that the physical being, that the physical life, that all the stuff that's happening here is nothing, okay? Because there's something else that as you back into that and reflect on that, makes the whole thing be different.
I like that. If you put your mind and your effort on what goes to dust, then you're going to be really upset when when all the things that you put your mind to are going to dust. But if you put your mind on what is not dust, and you put your efforts on what is not dust, then you won't be as bothered when inevitably everything starts to go towards dust, because the dust is happening whether you like it or not, is part of his
Well,
message.
the part of you that is I, the part of you that is your self-experience, from every perspective is not a material thing. Now, there's all kinds of stuff about this. If you're going to get into Lucretius, who decided that that the brain and all of our thoughts, etc., was from the brain, and the brain dissolves after death. If you're going to be a radical materialist, then even your I, even your self, your inner experience of I-ness is a material thing. But that particular view, I don't know, do most of you have that view where you're a radical materialist, that you really feel that the whole experience of seeing, feeling, everything else is all braining, which is what most materialists think. It's all our brain. Or is there something else cooking there?
There's a wonderful book called Infinite Awareness. And that's written by a neuroscientist, and the whole book is about her exploring this from a very scientific point of view, of exploring all the theories of where consciousness comes from. Is it only in the brain? I mean, she believes in that's not the case from her meditative experience, but she approaches from a scientific. It's a beautiful book, Infinite Awareness, and I really recommend it. But in Judaism, Judaism obviously believes there's not that the I, the consciousness, is not only in the mind or in the physical brain, but it takes Judaism, at least the Kabbalah, takes it further, right? It talks about 5 different levels of soul. So in Judaism, there's parts of your personality which you do lose with breath. There's parts of the I, so to speak, which do leave a death. Your personality doesn't stay with you when you die. Kabbalah, or much of Kabbalah, believes in reincarnation. So there's a part of you which reincarnates, from life to life. But in Kabbalah, there's different parts of the I. So in some ways, the deepest part of the I in Kabbalah, there's a part of our I which is the same as every other human being. The deepest part of our I, which is the Chaya, the 5th level of the soul, is in Kabbalah part of all of life. It's kind of like infinity. So there's a part of our I, when you have a thought, I don't want to go too much into this, but when you have a thought, every thought may begin with an I, but if you go back to the beginning of every thought to that I, there's a part of that I which is linked to the I of everyone else in the whole world, which is a beautiful idea, right? And a beautiful.
Well, it allows us to communicate. If there weren't a sameness across all the human beings, we couldn't talk to each other.
And the tradition does, we were talking about Adam before, we have one of the beautiful statements in the Mishnah that says, right, that we all come from Adam. Why did we have this story of Adam and Eve? To teach us that we all come from one source. So we all have that part of us. I'm going to move on to chapter 4, unless anybody else wanted to add or had a thought. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to add that I think there's mentions in the Torah, like Bezalel was given, the skill to be able to create the tabernacle, but he also had he had I don't know how to say it, but his heart, he was also given a heart that
the wisdom of the heart.
Right, exactly.
The wisdom of the heart, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that the heart is also related, to what happens in your brain. It's not a separate thing. And I think there's a relationship there that affects how you think or what you think about.
Beautiful. It's on some level, the heart is the key, but yeah, thank you for bringing that in. It's I'm still thinking how to bring that in with our discussion and everything else that we're talking about. But I think very true, and maybe part of, what's, we go through all these seasons, of planting and of uprooting and Donna just changed states, and people change where they live. So there's seasons where you're suddenly uprooted from the place where you've lived for like 20 years or 30 years, and suddenly you're in a new place, and there's seasons for all of it. Well, how we all have to go through that on some level. So what maybe how you go through it with your heart is part of the answer of, how you bring meaning and wisdom to how you go through all of it. Okay, well, let's get to chapter 4. Norma, do you mind reading the first few lines for us?
I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. Then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living. And happier than either are those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun.
Okay,
I have also-
let's keep it there. There is enough.
Okay.
Thanks.
I mean, you said that you don't look at this necessarily as depressing.
Yeah.
Suppose you could look at this as it's a fact that there's oppression, and that oftentimes people don't have anyone to comfort them.
I feel a little bit challenged by this. Okay, go comfort them. So there is someone to comfort them,
Yeah.
You're going to be the ones who just stand there and don't comfort the oppressed, or are you going to try and go and do something about it? I mean, there's, he is describing a truth of the world on some level, on some level.
One would hope that as a king, though, he has more power to at least contribute to relieving oppression.
Yeah.
And maybe he feels powerless because there are elements of oppression that he can't affect.
Yeah. I mean, as a leader, it's probably depressing if you're the leader of, of a country or of a place. And it's hard. I remember when my family lived in India for 6 months when I was a teenager, and I just looked at the never-ending shanty towns, and I'm just like, how could you ever, just to be able to change that would take, endless, the money would be endless. I'm not sure how you would ever do it. And even as a 14-year-old, I had that thought. I'm like, how could you ever do that? I mean, the amount of time and money and energy to take Calcutta and to lift up, those endless miles of people living on the street is just, it must be really depressing for a leader to have the amount of work and the drop in the bucket feeling of trying to alleviate poverty. The mayor of Chicago, it's the downtown's doing pretty okay, but the West Side it's got challenges, and how do you help? What do you do, and where to start? And
But isn't King Solomon, I'm not talking about Koheleth, the persona that is, right, it's attributed to him, right? Isn't Koheleth one of the oppressors? Isn't that what broke his kingdom? Was that one of the things that broke his kingdom was that he was oppressing and enslaving people to build the temple and to build his projects. And the taxes that were levied upon the Israelites for this building, right? I'm I'm very confused by the persona in
Mhm.
these 3 or 4 verses, because he's the king. He is the
Mhm.
oppressor. All oppression flows from him. If he wants to stop the oppression, he is actually the best positioned person to
Hmm.
stop the oppression. So why is he taking this third person invisible position? I don't know. And he also, what's confusing to me here in these 3-4 lines is he seems to be anti-life. He's saying those who died long since are more fortunate than those who are alive right now.
Hmm.
Really? So death is preferable to living right now in the moment? I mean, that's one.
Or even better, not being born at all.
Right. And then the next line is maybe I should never have been born at all. Okay.
Yeah.
So what is he really saying here? Is it better not to be born at all?
He needs to make an appointment with Norma.
Tell him off.
Yeah. Well, I did. I
Set him
have.
straight, right?
Well, the first part of what you're saying, I thought of as well, which is, King Solomon is criticized on some level by the tradition. I mean, he's obviously celebrated, but he's also criticized for levying taxes. And, he, to build a temple, it took 30,000, was it? Forced labor and shifts, and,
A
it doesn't,
lifetime of oppression.
probably didn't feel too good if you're one of those forced, in a shift of forced labor. And, even more so, the temple, I think, it took 2-3 years to build, but his palace took like 7 years to build. So he spent even more time building the palace, his own palace, and that was also requiring all this forced labor and, maybe a few forced donations along the way too, right? So he was driving it, but I think he's talking to us not from that place he's talking from a place of a leader, of a ruler. And maybe what I was saying earlier also about, wealth and power bring you certain things, but they all also bring a lot of suffering, power, with second you start getting to power, the second you have power, you have people challenging you for power, right? That's just the way power works. The second you have power, you're going to have others who are going to challenge you for that power. And that's not a fun game to play. Maybe it's fun when you're younger, and then, Solomon's watching, even if you want to go into what happened to Solomon, look what happened to his sons. He built up this incredible kingdom and the temple, and his sons lost it within half a generation, and the kingdoms were separated, and, he probably saw that coming. And so, you spend your whole life building something, and then you see your children are about to lose it, and that's pretty depressing. And
Maybe he's looking back and saying, "Do such a good job."
Say again the last part.
Maybe he's looking back at what he did because he's older when he wrote this and saying he didn't do such a good job as a leader.
Yeah.
Maybe he is talking about himself. What is about to happen?
Nancy, you said that, it was really up to him, he created this situation, and, he could have turned it around. But I don't know, I suspect if you're the king, particularly at that time, that, you kind of get to a certain point, you have the inertia of all of the years, the decades, you're in power, but, trying to think about, as bad as you may think it is, how to turn it around could be overwhelming.
Yeah. I was thinking of.
Go ahead, Carol.
I was thinking of the same thing, kind of the loneliness at the top when you're trying to make decisions, and they're not always easy to make, nor do what looks like a good decision always looks good to everyone else.
The criticism, and it's not everything. You think you're all powerful, but in the end, you realize things have a life of their own, and you can't control everything. And I think we all have that in our lives at some level. I mean, I was thinking also of how hard it is to be a leader on some level, and also maybe we all have those moments where we feel like he does, or or periods, hopefully not many in our life, but maybe our job is not to go to the place where he goes, right? Our job is to say, no, I'm not going to go to that place. It's better if I wasn't born, right? That's what Norma would tell Kohelet when Kohelet comes to see him. Don't go to that place, or why are you going to that place? Don't go to that place, don't let yourself, that's a dark place to live in. I mean, I'm reminded of another, I was talking about Hillel and Shammai, right? Hillel and Shammai had another, or their schools, Hillel and Shammai were the first two rabbis of all time. And they had their schools had a debate that lasted 2.5 years, right? 2.5 years. Is it a good thing that human beings were created or not, right? So Hillel, who's always an optimist, says it's a good thing. It's better that human beings were created than not. And Shammai, who was more the pessimist, said it would have been better if human beings were not created. So this is kind of that argument. Like, look what human beings do to each other. They oppress each other. They're no better than beasts, right? That's sort of the continuation of the previous thought. Where, look what human beings do to each other. But Hillel is the optimist, and we're a Hillel-like tradition. We always go with the optimism, and that I was teaching that to the high schoolers again last Sunday. I was saying, we're the Hillel tradition. We light the Hanukkah candles going up 1, 2, 3, because we believe in more light, more holiness, and we can do something about it. The world, the first noble truth of Buddhism is there's suffering in the world, right? I think that's the first truth, and so maybe that's true, but our Jewish tradition says the world is broken, but we want to go and fix the world, right? Even if it's just calling somebody up and making them feel better, or whatever it is, we believe in trying to fix the world. And on the other hand, what happened to that debate that lasted 2.5 years, right? They debated for 2.5 years, is it a good thing the world was created or not? In the end, they came to a resolution, which they usually don't, but the resolution is it would have been better if human beings were not created, but since we are created, we should go ahead and do good deeds.
There's a view which
Amen.
is very interesting.
I
Oh.
over it.
Go ahead. There's a view that's quite interesting that a friend of mine named Nietzsche had, and his view was that God is still philosophizing, which means that he's still trying to work out what is good. He did his creation thing, and now he's sitting back and he's trying to think through what is the form of human structure, of human nature that is good. Now, good, the Greeks were into the good. They were, that's what the philosopher was supposed to be doing, was trying to get to the good. Well, Nietzsche has God trying to get to the good. So maybe all of this stuff is in fact an attempt to work out different scenarios as to what turns out to be the good, for us, for the world, for the animals, for the whole thing. And I sort of like that view because it has the divinity still at work up to something, rather than having worked and being up to nothing. And it sort of implies that it's part of our share here to be working out what is the good. And I think Judaism has a tremendous strain in it that has that particular dimension too.
It is very interesting. Kabbalah, which kind of, well, it says, God is one, obviously God echad, but then it kind of says like there's almost like different parts of that oneness in Kabbalah, and in parts of Kabbalah, the lower parts of God so to speak. I mean, this is a very big topic, but the lower parts of God are still evolving, and they're evolving with humanity, right? And we can help them, right? Like the God in the infinite, of course, is completely perfect and completely one, and there is no movement, but in the Ein Sof, but there are parts of God that are still we're still evolving, which seems a little heretical to say it, but it depends how you quite position yourself in it. But we're, at least one way to say it is that there's parts of the heavens are not that far from us, are also a work in progress, so to speak, and that's all evolving together in one big cosmic movement upwards, right? That's kind of the way. This is Rav Kook, right? Rav Kook, who is the first chief rabbi of Palestine, but pre-state Israel. He believed very much in spiritual evolution, and he was really latched onto that theme within our tradition, that everything is evolving, the cosmos is evolving, humanity is evolving, everything, we're all trying to evolve and slowly go forward and gain more wisdom, more light. I mean, it's a beautiful image.
I had a small question earlier. In line 2, then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living. Is those translated as those people, or because could it be referring to kings, or just curious?
The
word those, is it?
Those, no, it's the dead that already died. The dead that already died is those.
Right. But I mean, is it people, or is it maybe
he just says dead.
or
He just says the dead. The dead who already died.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
it's not. There's actually a noun there.
Okay.
So I think he is referring more broadly to all people. Yeah, and those who are still living. Yeah, and it's a down kind of idea.
Very. He's saying it is better never to have lived than to have lived and lost. Is he saying the exact opposite of better to have loved and lost than never to have been lost? It's the total opposite.
It's better to have never lived than to have loved and lost. Is what he's saying on some level. But and that's why I say, he's being transparent, which I also appreciate, right? He's bearing his heart, and he's bearing his heart, and he's being very real about what he's feeling. And
but Nancy doesn't like it.
I know. So we can say, hey, Kohelet, our job is not to go to that place, and our job is to resist that place, right? Our job is to say, that's, not listen to that voice within ourselves. Yes,
But it may be that the unborn are in a place. I mean, is he implying that the unborn are in a place? Because that's also part of a certain Jewish tradition. That before you're born, you're actually in a place, and maybe the place is a cooler place than the one we're here now being in. Maybe he's referring to that. I don't know.
No, that's I thought that too. The place before you're born, before you come into our world, which is difficult, but is a school, is a place where you learn. That place may be a place that's a place of a place of feeling connection, right? It's on some level, what I feel a lot, maybe we'll end with this, is, there's a lack of connection. There's an aloneness to life in this world, a lack of connection, which takes us back to the Garden of Eden and separate consciousness. And, maybe the answer to feeling that aloneness and that feeling of separation, of separate consciousness, and of futility, the only thing that we have really to counter that is the feeling of connection to self, connection to God, and connection to others. Because in the end, that's what you got. Because and that feeling of connection to self is transcendent. And the places in the book where Kohelet does transcend and talks about God and talks about that is that's a lot of our, that's Unatani Tokef, right? Everything is a shard of, everything is temporal, but God is everlasting, right? We say those words. V'tahu melech chai v'kayam, but you are the living and everlasting God.
Now, it's
So-
interesting that you're saying that and that you talked about that committee that you started, because at David's class on Monday night, one individual made a comment that sort of applies here, that we were talking about things we wanted to discard or be rid of. And what this individual said was the fear of being alone.
Hmm.
And I thought that was pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Well, the fear of being alone in some way, the biggest fear of death is some way that fear of being alone, right? Or
Yeah, right. And that's what that
no-
person was referring
nothingness.
to, living alone and being that way.
So maybe we and with a bracha that it's Kohelet that takes us to that place of kind of contemplating the aloneness, despite whatever possessions, despite whatever the aloneness of the human condition, that should also awaken in us the place of connection to ourself and to the idea that we're actually never alone, because we're always with the universal consciousness. If we can find that place, and maybe there's a place to also reach others through that self, through that universal consciousness, and maybe that's where we find the comfort and the happiness, because that there is comfort and happiness in the rest of life, but all where it's ultimately found. So may we we're about to take a few weeks break, so may we all feel comforted and not alone in the next few weeks until we start our study again.
Have a marvelous
Okay.
trip too, so
Thank you.
enjoy your parents.